It's Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today. This episode, I'm going to talk about the recent debate that took place between Candace Owens and Shmuley Boteach. The context of this debate is that they have had a feud, if you like, where Shmuley Boteach has been calling Candace Owens, and those who don't know who Candace Owens is, I don't really follow her either, but she is a political, cultural commentator on the right, and Shmuley Boteach has called her an anti-Semite. Candace Owens apparently or allegedly has called Shmuley Boteach all kinds of names, and there's been threats backwards and forwards. I don't want to get into the whole details because I don't really know exactly what went on there, and neither does it interest me that much. But the two of them did have a debate on Piers Morgan's show, and it was supposed to be a debate about, I suppose, whether Candace Owens was an anti-Semite or not. And I won't comment on how the debate went. I'll allow my listeners and viewers to go and see it for themselves and make their own judgment about how it went and who won, etc. But I do want to focus on Candace Owens' opening statement. And what she said was, in my view, so problematic, let's call it. And I'm going to get into why. But Shmuley Boteach, who I know, I've met him, I've spent time with him, and he's a really wonderful guy. In this case, didn't actually respond to Candace Owens' opening statement. And I think that that was a huge missed opportunity here, because what she said needs to be responded to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through what she said point by point and then respond to it point by point, because it needs to be responded. And this is how I wish Shmuley Boteach would have responded to Candace Owens. So here's what she said, and I'm going to paraphrase her. First of all, she made the point that so most religions have radical fringe sects, and I think that's a fair point. It's true. Judaism also has radical fringe sects. I would consider Notori Carta, for example, who are a group of people who are anti-Zionists, and they find common cause with the likes of Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. I would find them to be a radical fringe sect. Judaism has them as well as other religions. They also have them. So that's correct. I would agree with her on that. And then she equates white supremacy with radical Judaism. And we're going to get into that as well. But that now is going in a different direction, because it's not just radical. What does radical mean? Radical really can mean anyone who is very extreme or has a very strong opinion about a particular thing, either to the right or to the left. You might call radical, and radical is all relative to what it's radical from. So, some people might say that they're radical Democrats, in other words, Democrats with a small d, that they believe in democracy in a radical way. Is that necessarily bad? So radical doesn't always mean bad, but then she equated radical with white supremacy. So I'm going to just point that out. And then she gets into Menachem Schneerson, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, otherwise known as the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And she doesn't quote Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson directly, rather she quotes him through the works of Israel Shahak. And then what she does is she uses some of the quotations, which I believe are probably correct quotations, about the body of a Jew being of a qualitatively different nature than the body of a non-Jew, and quotes Israel Shahak and his co-author, a book which came out in the 90s about that. And therefore she says that Menachem Mendel Schneerson is therefore a person who harbors a tremendous amount of hatred towards all non-Jews. Now, I have no reason necessarily to defend the teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. I was, at one point in my life, a follower of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. I was actually a Chabad Shliach, so I was one of his emissaries. So I am very familiar with his teachings, and I'm familiar with this particular part of his teachings as well. So I want to give context to that. But I don't have necessarily a reason to defend these teachings, and neither will I really defend these teachings in this episode. But I want to give the correct context to these teachings so they're understood in the correct context. Because technically, she's right that these teachings exist, but it's important to understand these teachings in the correct historical context and where they come from. I do believe that it's factually incorrect to say that the late Lubavitcher Rebbe had hatred towards all non-Jews. I think that's factually incorrect. Again, I have no reason to say it's correct or incorrect, necessarily to defend the Rebbe or Chabad, but I just think that's factually incorrect. He did not have hatred towards all non-Jews. I think that that's clear from his interactions with non-Jews and also some of his teachings about the 7 Noahide laws, etc., that obviously he didn't hate all non-Jews. I think that's just incorrect. So the two need to be separated. Some of his teachings about you might want to use the word supremacy of the Jew, if you like, and his feelings towards non-Jews. You can, especially in Judaism, have a belief about the supremacy of Jews and have respect and love for all non-Jews as well. Now, I know in other, and we'll get into it, in other kinds of supremacy that can't exist, but in Judaism, perhaps uniquely to Judaism, those two can exist together. Then she goes on to connect all of that with what's going on in Israel today. So she jumps right from talking about the teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe through the prism of Israel Shahak to what she considers to be a fringe government in Israel today, and basically considers the government of Bibi Netanyahu, which has within it all types of people. And actually, to my knowledge, there are no followers of the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, in the government. So I don't understand really that connection between that, except for that Shmuley Boteach is a follower, or claims to be a follower. Whether he is or not, I'll let other people decide, of the late Lubavitcher Rebbe. But she connects that directly with a fringe extremist government which exists now, and therefore what's going on in the war, and how the war is being prosecuted by this fringe extreme government which believes in this supremacy. So she's put that all together. Now, it's clear to me that these are the thoughts of an anti-Semite. These aren't the thoughts of someone who cares to actually look at this in any kind of way objectively, and certainly not with a sympathetic view of the Jews. So I think that just her introduction itself, and I'm going to get into why in greater detail, shows that she is, at the very least, a hater of Orthodox Jews. And if not that, she certainly hates all Jews. Perhaps non-Orthodox Jews she doesn't hate. But Israel Shahak was a notorious hater of Orthodox Jews, what are known as Haredim in Israel. It's important to go back why she's quoting Israel Shahak and what was Israel Shahak's agenda. So it's important to give a little bit of historical context to that first, because the fact that someone like Candace Owens is willing to quote Shahak to give the context to why she thinks Shmuley Boteach is a white supremacist or Jewish supremacist, and therefore is fringe radical Jew, is really telling. Let's go back to 1965. So in 1965, there was a great controversy, which ended up being known as the Shahak affair. What happened was that he claimed to have witnessed an Arab who needed to go to the hospital, having a heart attack, having some kind of an event that needed to go to the hospital. And they asked an ultra-Orthodox Jew at the time whether they could use his phone. And the ultra-Orthodox Jew, according to Shahak, refused to allow them to use the phone to call the ambulance because it was for a non-Jew and that would violate the Shabbat. So this happened on Shabbat, on a Saturday, where Jews aren't allowed to use the phone. And therefore, this Orthodox Jew, according to Shahak, did not allow them to use the phone, and therefore this non-Jew ended up dying. Something to that nature. And it became a big controversy because it showed that, according to Shahak, that the life of a non-Jew was just not as valuable as the life of the Jew. And even worse, it's more valuable and important for a Jew to keep Shabbat than to save the life of a non-Jew. And that was his argument. And it became a big story. And just to cut to the end, it turned out that after a number of people looked into this story, that this story was made up of whole cloth by Israel Shahak. So this was a blood libel against Haredi Jews, against ultra-Orthodox Jews, by Israel Shahak, because he hates Haredi Jews. And he was also a friend of Noam Chomsky. These are well-known Jewish anti-Semites. So she's quoting someone who made up stories in order to libel a whole section of Jews. So it makes sense that someone who believes and creates blood libels would, at the same time, find a bedfellow like Shahak, who himself created this blood libel. And in the end, it seems that Shahak himself admitted that this never happened. So this is who this guy Shahak is. And I want to jump into a little bit of some of the story and some of the scholarship around the Shahak affair, because Emanuel Jacobowitz, who was the chief rabbi of Britain for a number of years, the late chief rabbi Lord Emanuel Jacobowitz of blessed memory, he wrote an essay about this, and he explains why this would never have occurred. In other words, why it's impossible that a Orthodox Jew who understood the law would not allow his phone to be used in order to save the life of a non-Jew on Shabbat. And that is because Jewish law explicitly not just allows one to use the phone to save the life of a non-Jew on Shabbat, it tells one to break Shabbat in order to save the life of a non-Jew. So, take a couple steps back. Technically speaking, according to the strict letter of the law, perhaps one would not be allowed to break Shabbat in order to save the life of a non-Jew. However, there is such a thing called mishum eva, which means because of enmity, and that is a device, according to Lord Jacobowitz, which is used in order to circumvent that law. In other words, the rabbis came up with an ingenious way in which to circumvent this law, which would cause racism. So what did they do? They came up with this idea called mishum eva, because of enmity, and they said that what might happen here is that if a Jew did not break Shabbat to save the life of a non-Jew, that would cause enmity. And you don't want to have enmity between these communities, because that could lead to war, and war leads to the further loss of life. And therefore, since you don't want enmity, therefore it is important in order to save lives of Jews and non-Jews, eventually, because you'll end up with a war where both sides get hurt. Therefore, it is incumbent upon one to actually break the Shabbat in order to save the life of a non-Jew. And that's the law, settled law in Judaism. So there's no way that a non-Jew who is in trouble would not be saved by a Jew because he wants to keep the Shabbat. In fact, he would have to break the Shabbat in order to save the non-Jew's life. And Lord Jacobowitz then goes on to argue that this is actually a device which is used by the rabbis quite a bit in order to be able to circumvent certain laws which would cause problems, and including racism, and including other things which could really end up hurting people in the long run. So, for example, the Ben Soromora, which is the rebellious son, the wayward son, there's this whole law in the Torah about what happens if you have a wayward son, etc. Then the parents take them to the elders of the city, and the child ends up being killed in front of the entire congregation. The rabbis took that law and narrowed its criteria to the degree that it would be impossible to ever implement that law. So that law ends up being basically not relevant. So yes, it exists, it's written in the Torah, but the rabbis reread that law in a way in which makes it irrelevant, and it's not implementable at all, so you can't implement it. And this is, according to Lord Jacobowitz, what the rabbis did. They took a lot of these laws from the Torah. They didn't change the laws themselves, they just changed the parameters around them to make it that they are no longer relevant, and therefore bring them in line with practice which makes sense with more of a modern way of thinking about things. And the way they did that was this device, either by limiting their criteria, or the example of this one is Mishum Eva, which is because of enmity, and they said, well, this could cause enmity, and the probability that this would cause enmity is so significant that it trumps the idea of having to keep the Shabbat, and therefore one should break the Shabbat in order to avoid a consequence or an outcome of enmity between Jews and non-Jews. So it shows that even the radicals, and these were radicals, these are people who are, you might call fundamentalists. And by the way, to talk about, because she used the word fundamentalist, it's important to understand what fundamentalists are. Fundamentalists are people who have a literal reading of the Torah, or a literal reading of the text, and they go and they just accept it literally. And I don't consider myself to be a fundamentalist today, but there are lots of fundamentalists within Judaism. But even within the fundamentalists, they use these devices like Mishum Eva, like because of enmity, in order to be able to have their fundamentalism and also live successfully in the world as well at the same time. So this is really interesting that although there might be some fundamentalism in believing, for example, that the world was created in 6 days, 6 literal days of 24 hours, that Noah actually built an ark and there was a flood, etc., etc. All these stories actually occurred and they happened, and the world is only close to 6,000 years old, etc. These are things which the fundamentalists will accept as fact. But even within the fundamentalists themselves, there are these laws, like the one of breaking Shabbat in order to save a non-Jew's life, which they've changed. So when she uses the word fundamentalism, you have to understand that yes, they're fundamentalists, but within Judaism, that fundamentalism doesn't lead one to killing of people or hurting non-Jews or treating them with disrespect. As a matter of fact, the Torah cares so much about non-Jews that the law which is said more than almost any other law in the Torah is how you should treat the ger. And this she totally forgets about, which is that there's a fundamental law in the Torah which is how you should treat the stranger amongst you. So that person who's an immigrant, even if they're not Jewish, you need to treat them as you treat yourself and as you treat the other people amongst you. And that is a law which is said in the Torah more times than any other. So that's important to understand. The context here is that from a practical perspective, one has to treat the non-Jew in the same way one treats the Jew. And one's even obligated to break the Shabbat in order to save the life of a non-Jew, just like one would be obligated to save the life of a Jew. And one is obligated, according to the Torah, to treat the stranger who's not Jewish, the immigrant, who lives amongst you, in the same way, if not better, because the Torah reminds us, because you were once slaves in Egypt. So you understand what it means to be a stranger in a strange land, and therefore you're obligated to treat the stranger with respect and dignity, which is one of the reasons why if you come to Israel, Arabs are treated equally to Jews. Why? Because that's an obligation. It's a part and fundamental of the Jewish tradition and our laws is to treat the strangers with respect and dignity and to allow them to live in our land and treat them in the same way we treat everyone else. That's some of the context here. So talk about, she raises Shahak, and of course Shahak finds those passages found in the teachings of the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, which seem very controversial. But it's important to first understand who Shahak is. He created this blood libel against the ultra-Orthodox community, which was proven to be false. Not only was it proven to be factually false, but also it couldn't have happened because the law is simply not in line with what he says. She quotes this person who's a known hater of the ultra-Orthodox community. And within Judaism itself, there are laws which obligate the person to treat the stranger and the other and the non-Jew with respect and dignity, and to not treat them like the other. Now, I want to address the teachings which are found that say that the body of the Jew is somehow qualitatively better than the body of the non-Jew. These are ideas which I've dealt with on my podcast. We interviewed Dan Rickman and we discussed it in length. And Dan, rightly, according to many people, takes these ideas to task and he considers them to be racist ideas. That's his view. Candace Owens agrees with that. I guess Israel Shahak also agrees with that. But it's important to give proper context to this because these aren't ideas that just exist within Judaism, they exist elsewhere as well. But besides that, where do they come from? The first source of it that I'm aware of is Yehuda Halevi back in the Middle Ages. He wrote a book called the Kuzari. And in the Kuzari, he talks about this idea of the Inyan Eloki, which is the concept of God, or which exists within Jews. And he traces it back from Adam and goes from Adam and comes down the line. Eventually it ended up in Abraham. And then from Abraham, it went to Isaac and Jacob, and then to all the Jews. And the Jews have this inyan eloki, this concept of God in them that makes them uniquely Jewish. So what makes a Jew is that they have as an inheritance this godly concept within them. It's a part of the qualitatively different soul, divine soul that they have, that Jews have, that non-Jews simply don't have. And that's what the Kuzari talks about. And it found its way into the Kabbalah, and the Kabbalah really goes to town on this idea that Jews have, from a spiritual perspective, a soul which is qualitatively different than the non-Jews, and eventually ended up in the teachings of the late Lubavitcher Rebbe and others, which says that actually also has an impact on the body as well. So the body also takes on this some kind of qualitative difference than the non-Jews. Now, that doesn't mean what she said was that Jews are a different species. That's not what it means, by the way. It's not that we're different species. It means there's some kind of aspect of it which is infused with a type of divinity which that is not infused in the bodies of non-Jews. And there are different aspects in which are discussed around this, about the idea of free will and etc. about the non-Jew. And so that magnum opus of Chabad, written by Rabbi Shneerson of Liadi, called the Tanya, he talks about this idea as well, that a Jew has a ched kami mal mamesh, which is his soul has a godly soul, whereas non-Jews do not have a godly soul. That godly soul is a part of God. Non-Jews do not have a godly soul according to him. And because of that, Jews have the ability for altruism, whereas non-Jews don't have the same ability for altruism as Jews have. So that exists in the Tanya as well. And a lot of people, including Dan Rickman, take issue with these ideas. But the historical context of them is that they actually come from the Kuzari in the 1200s, in the Middle Ages. So they've been around for a very, very long time. What you need to ask yourself, though, is what is the practical implication of these ideas? In other words, within Judaism, what are the practical implications of having these ideas? All religions, all cultures, and all nationalities have within them a dose of I would consider to be healthy exceptionalism. So a lot of Americans believe in American exceptionalism, and other countries believe also in their exceptionalism. So, I mean, if you go around, you find this idea of people believing their exceptionalism. As a matter of fact, people in their families believe in a healthy way that their families are greater and better than all other families. I believe personally, for example, that my kids are the greatest kids in the world. I believe that my wife is the most amazing woman in the world. She's the most amazing woman. She is. I really believe that. That's my personal belief in it. Because I believe wholeheartedly that my kids are the greatest kids around. No one has greater kids than my kids. It's just what I think. I'm entitled to that opinion. What is the practical application, though, of that opinion? Does that mean I go and hurt other people's kids? No, of course not. Does that mean I even say that other people's kids, therefore, are worse than my kids? No, I don't walk around thinking that either. I just think in the positive, my kids are the greatest kids in the world. Now, if I had to get around and build a theology around it, I might build a theology around it, which other people might say, hey, dude, that's taking a little bit too far. But as long as I'm not hurting anyone, that's fine. I mean, I can believe whatever I want to believe about my own family, and people do. It's healthy to think that somehow you have something which is greater than other people within you. I mean, it's the way humans behave. We think that way about ourselves. It's good self-esteem to think that I have something to offer other people don't have to offer. And that's fine. It's okay to believe that until it pushes other people down. My mother used to say when I was growing up that there's two ways in which you can show that you're better. You can either step on a pedestal and stand up, it makes you higher than others, or you can push someone else into the ditch. If you elevate yourself, that's fine. That's different than pushing other people down into a ditch. These ideas, what she calls Jewish supremacy, although they do make me feel somewhat uncomfortable, because they do seem to veer very close to this idea of not just Jewish exceptionalism, but in some sense Jews being qualitatively better, and using that idea that the body of a Jew is somehow better or greater, infused more with divinity than the body of a non-Jew, which makes it qualitatively better physical body. That idea does make me feel uncomfortable because it's so close to some really, really evil ideologies like Nazism that exist out there. and white supremacy that exists out there. But I don't think we would have a problem with supremacy as long as they didn't come along and say that we are supreme and therefore we have to kill everyone else. That's the problem with white supremacy. Now, I'm not saying it's the only problem, but the key problem with white supremacy is that it comes together with a hatred of the other. And in Judaism, it does not come along with the hatred of the other. It didn't come along for Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, with hatred of the other. That's where Candace Owens is wrong. That's where she's lying. She's simply lying about this. It's not true. Not only did it not come along with hatred, but as a matter of fact, this was a person who also cared for other people, and he wanted them to also do well, and wanted his movement, etc., to actually reach out to non-Jews. Again, I'm a post-Chabadnik, so I don't have a need to defend Chabad, but this, what she's saying, is simply not true. It's a lie. And the fact that she's basing it on Israel Shahak, who's a documented liar about ultra-Orthodox Jews, just proves where she's coming from. So I've had half an hour or so to debunk and go through what she said. Shmuley Boteach didn't have that long, but he didn't even deal with what she said in her preamble. I wish she would have just stuck to what she said in her preamble, because it would have shown in her own words and what she told the audience in that interview, in that debate, that she was an anti-Semite. Because only an anti-Semite would come up with this. Because someone who looked at it objectively would say, yes, there is such a thing as you might call Jewish supremacy. It's found in the Torah itself, as a matter of fact. V'niflinu ani v'amcha, the idea that somehow the Jews are the chosen people. This is not new. Jews believe they're the chosen people. They do. Is that kind of Jewish supremacy? Yes, in some sense. But together with that comes the obligation to treat others with respect and dignity. Together with that is the law, which is said and repeated more often than any other law, that you need to treat the stranger like yourself because you want strangers in the land of Egypt. Together with that comes a tradition of rabbis using these ideas to modify laws in order to make sure that non-Jews are treated equally to Jews, so that these concepts don't creep in. So on a practical level, Jews treat non-Jews with respect and dignity. And the rabbi which she quoted is somebody who cared to make sure that the 7 Noahide laws were spread and taught also to non-Jews, because he cared about non-Jews, not because he hated them. So the Jewish tradition is, yes, to have some kind of Jewish supremacy. And maybe that's radical, perhaps, but radical compared to what? Compared to saying that everyone's equal and the same, and therefore no one has anything which is special and unique to offer. And that's the other thing. The Jews believe that they have this thing in order because they have something unique to offer to the world, to be a light unto the nations. To be a light unto the nations. And as a matter of fact, I will add to that within Judaism, there's this idea that if you don't live up to this, you're actually worse than everybody else. So, yes, there's a gift which is given to Jewish people to be a light unto the nations. And some people might take that to say that that means that they have an inyan elokי in them, a godly concept, or to use the language of the Tanya, a part of God within them. And some people might even take that to the degree to say that that means that their body is qualitatively better in some way. However, the flip side of that is that if they don't live up to it, they become worse than everybody else. And it's very hard to live up to. So you might say, well, we're better. Well, we're better if we live up to what we're supposed to live up to. But the vast majority of Jews, are struggling to live up to it. So in an operational sense, we're not better. In an operational sense, we're probably worse because we're not living up to it. We don't walk around with our nose in the air saying we're better. We say we're privileged in the sense that we have this relationship with the divine in a way in which gives us an obligation to behave in a certain way. And that includes caring for the world and caring for others, caring for non-Jews, not hating them. So these are simple lies which came out of the mouth of Candace Owens, clearly coming out of the mouth of a anti-Semite who's distorted everything. And again, if you look at my background, I don't have a reason to defend any of this, but I need to defend it because she's lying. And I wish that, again, that Shmuley Boteach would have just stuck to those first few words she said, because he would have been able to prove his point and show that she was an anti-Semite just based on that preamble and that introduction that she said. Final thought on this, and that is that her connection then of her lies about Judaism, lies about Jews, distortion, bringing in Israel Shahak, totally distorting that which Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson said, and then connecting that to the war in Gaza today, was the greatest sin of all, if you like. Because what she was trying to say, therefore, is that it's the hatred that the Jews, this radical fringe government, has for non-Jews that is causing them to act this way towards the Palestinians. And that is the greatest lie of all. It's simply a lie. So she built a lie. She built a blood libel, and really was a blood libel against the Jews, using the work of Shahak, who was a known hater of ultra-Orthodox Jews, and then basically took that to say that the reason why Israel is bombing Gaza is not because of its own security, not because it wants to make sure that our women don't get raped again, and our men don't get beheaded and taken captive, and our children don't get put into ovens and burnt alive. No, that wasn't the reason. The reason is because we hate the Palestinians. That's her mind. That's what she's saying. It's simply unbelievable. Unbelievable that someone like Piers Morgan would give a lady like this any kind of platform. So it's all built on lies and total fabrication of what the proper Jewish position is. And I would never debate this woman, but certainly it needs to be put out there, the proper context. I'm not denying anything that she said. I'm just giving the right context around what she said so that people understand that nothing she said was true. These were all lies and a besmirching of the good name of the Jewish people, of a rabbi, and of the people of Israel and the government of Israel, and it ought not to stand. This has been Levi Brackman with a special episode of Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thanks again for joining.